We have lights. Okay, I think we'll roll this outside and then attempt to start it. Hey everybody, welcome to my channel. My name is Brian. This is my 1984 Honda VF500F Interceptor. I've owned this bike since 1986. It's been through several iterations of running, not running, and today we're going to go for the running again. So I promise you in this video, this is part of a series, so we will ride this bike. Keep watching. So everything's hooked up. I'm going to leave the fuel line down here. We'll give it some cranks. Should have oil pressure light go out. And eventually we should start pumping fuel. This fuel's pretty old, but it's ethanol free, so maybe it won't be bad. Let's give it a few cranks. Doesn't smell too bad. It's pretty empty, so I'll put some fresh gas in there and we'll go from there. Give her a gallon or two of good old ethanol free. At this point, I can go ahead and hook the fuel hose up. Get some fuel into our carbs. Give the starter a rest and let's see what happens.
I see where it's coming from. See the little
Key on.
See it? Try again.
So we have fuel pouring out, so I need to pull this back apart and figure out where it's leaking. Great. Okay, so there may or may not have been a screw loose on one of the carb float bowls, and the spark plug wires may or may not have been on wrong. We're all hooked back up. Let's try this again. Let's give it a little choke. Carbs are going to be empty. So that sounds like it should. Oh, we really got fuel pouring out now. Great. So I rechecked that flow bowl. It was okay. I've temporarily hooked up a vacuum gauge pump to the petcock so it'll operate. You turn it on and crank it. So it pumps fuel and it just pours out everywhere. So my suspicion is whatever connects the carburetors together in the fuel supply, that is our problem. So I need to look and see if I can find parts to separate the carburetors from this base plate and replace. I'm guessing there's O-rings in there, but let me look for those. I was able to locate this Honda kit that should have the O-rings in here that I believe is our problem with fuel pouring out between the carburetors. So the fuel inlet comes in here, that's pressed in. It looks as though it goes back in a tube to the next carburetor, and I'm assuming that's held on with an O-ring. So theoretically, I can pull each carburetor off individually and not screw up the synchronization. So we'll start with this one because it's gonna have to go first. It has these tabs folded over for what I'm assuming are the screws that hold the carburetor to this zinc base plate. So we'll start with that, see where we get. This is probably one of those JIC screwdrivers. We'll try a number 3 Phillips and see what that does. Well, I got one of them. I'm not sure a 10mm socket's going to fit there. Let's try a little harder. I have a number 3 screwdriver. Phillips bit. I'm not crazy about that. And it needs to be longer. I believe the right combination of socket, short socket, non-locking extension. Give that a few taps. Nope. Try a 10mm flex socket. A few taps on that. And sort on there. Let's hope for the best. It turned. Not sure what else is going to hold this on here. Looks like the choke linkage. There's a tiny little cotter pin. You can get that off there. Lost a spring, we'll have to figure out where that lives. And that looks like an O-ring and a tube that looks like a vacuum deal. So I still need to find out where that spring lives, but it looks as though this little fuel pipe connects into this carburetor. I don't know if that'll show up, but there is an O-ring there, which I believe is our problem. So we should have the same setup on the next carburetor. So we'll set that aside. I'll go ahead and pull this one off. All right. Spring goes right there. Remember that small spring goes right there. And again, the choke linkage is problematic. I think we'll pull that one off up here. There's a washer above and below the little bushing. And then there's the choke linkage that goes on to the next carburetor. And then that O-ring seals the carb to the base plate. We might be able to leave all that connected, kind of peel this carburetor away and put our O-rings in and put it back together. Because this appears to be the O-ring, maybe where our problem is, because that's what joins the next two together. I decided to leave this one on here and go after this last one. I think it may make things a little easier. Let's try the impact driver. Awesome. Just remember which way that went in there. I guess it can only really go one way. All right. So theoretically, this one should be loose. Now the problem is now all this is linked together. Let's pull that cotter pin. Now this carburetor should come off. All right, so now we kind of have this mess going together here. So let me take a look at this, see what we need to replace. So my main problem is the fuel leaking between carburetors. This balance tube is what I guess supplies the fuel with this little washer, etc. So this O-ring is what appears to seal that, which is hard as a rock. So I purchased this kit, but now I'm a little bit suspicious whether or not this kit has all the parts I'm going to need, because it appears to have enough for one carburetor. So we'll fish out some of this and see if I can match up these O-rings, put this back together. So it appears that this is just kit for one carburetor. So the big O-ring I need, I'm not gonna have enough. That's that big hard one right there, but I'm not so sure that's the problem. Honestly, I'm thinking my problem is in this setup right here. I'm not sure how this goes together. I don't know if that's one molded piece or not, so let me do a little more digging and see if I can find more of these O-rings just for this purpose. So it's been a little while and I really need to get this back together before I forget how it all goes back together. So I discovered that these balance tubes are actually fuel supply tubes that supply fuel from the first carburetor all the way through to all the rest of them. Appears to be my problem where the O-rings are dried up, and then the middle it's got this little zigzag thing that actually really just has an O-ring. So I've searched, well, let me back up a step. I got the kit from Honda, which is enough for one carburetor, and that's $50 a piece. So I went through all kinds of measuring devices, metric and standard, and came up with an assortment of O-rings that I think will hopefully seal this all up and put it back together. So I got some from the Jungle Place, some from O-Rings and More, trying to find metric ones that were weird sizes. So the hope is I can put this back together and get these O-Rings in here without forgetting where this all goes. I've left this one lone carburetor on here, and then these two will kind of jam across this. So let me figure out if I can remember how all this goes back and see if I can get it put back on. So I spent last night getting that all back together. I still have one spring left over, and the book is no help telling me where it goes. So a few key points. You kind of just have to finagle those carburetors back onto that plate. There are some smaller springs that go in between. It's going to show up, but it's going to go in between where each carburetor connects, and there's an adjusting screw. So you kind of have to, if those come out, which they likely will, you have to kind of squeeze them back in. So I have all those back in there. Other than that large one, I'm not really which, like I said, I'm not really sure where it goes. So all the throttle works properly. The choke, which really, I guess, doesn't really choke anything, but it more enriches it. It has some large springs kind of on each one of those shafts. I guess just to keep it from flopping around or give it a little tension. Those all appear to be there. So it's like blazing hot out here today, so I may or may not try to figure out a way to leak test this before I put it back in the bike. But I think next we're going to get it back in the bike, and I may show you some of the tricks I've learned getting it back in. Could viewers actually ask about that? Because it's taken me so long to finish this, so we'll get on that next. So we're going to have to fish the carburetors in there below this little cross member in the front, and then figure out how to get the throttle cables back on them. And it is a tight fit. The wiring harness on this side, this plastic shield, the fuel supply gets hung up on the hard line for the clutch. So then you have to get the throttle cables fished down in there, back around the cams, and get them in the little grooves that hold the barrels in. So let me work on that. I was finally able to get the throttle cables connected. You pretty much have to snake them under this cross member and kind of work upside down on the carburetors and get them in, and then slide the carburetors down through. Still have the choke, that's pretty easy. So I've sprayed some WD-40 or motor oil, you can use whatever, into those locations where the boots go. So we're going to try to push the fronts in to their boots and then roll the rest of this down. So last night I managed to get the carburetors on there and somehow got the throttle cables on backwards, so it worked reverse. So I took it all back apart today, got the throttle cables functioning correctly, got the choke cable attached, got the screen back on for the air intake, finally got those godforsaken boots back on the carburetors, and I know of no good way to do that, so don't learn any lessons from me. Fuel line's hooked back up. So anyway, those carburetor boots, it can be so hit or miss. Sometimes they pop right in, other times it's a complete disaster. Haven't quite figured that out. I hope we don't need to figure it out anymore. All back together. I know we put fuel in it last time. Don't see any leaks from the carburetors, so here goes. Okay, I verified the fuel pump. It was actually pumping some fuel. I could feel it click. Took the line off, got some out, so we should be close at this point. So it acted like the fuel pump wasn't running. I ran a jumper wire from my back probe, the hot wire, the fuel pump, and I can make it run. So then I checked for power when I was cranking, and I can actually hear it running and see the power to it. So I think by maybe back probing it, I convinced it wanted to run. So maybe there was a bad connection there. I don't know. Here goes the money shot, finally. Looks like back to the drawing board. So after the last round of disappointment, pulled these carburetors back off, have them back on the bench, did some more searching, and I found these guys on the internet, on eBay. Arizona V65 magnets and sabers, and they sell a kit that should have all the VF500 O-rings we need. Instead of me trying to home grow the whole kit, we'll give that a shot this time. So once again, I'm going to pull this all apart and replace the O-rings where the fuel's leaking. So spent the last little while putting those new O-rings in there. I figured maybe this time I'd test it. So I got a fuel bottle, and that's actually fuel in there. Attached it to a little setup rig with a hose. I'm gonna turn it on and see. Go ahead and pre-fill this with fuel. On the bench, theoretically, that should work its way across all those O-rings through all those crossover tubes and fill up the bowl and all the carburetors. And let's hope it doesn't leak out this time. So we'll give that a little soaking and see how we turn out. Fuel has stopped running out of the bottle, so that should mean that the floats have floated and shut off the fuel inlets. So those flow bowls should be full of fuel. That means it had to work its way all the way across all those stupid O-rings through those passages. Okay, so I'm going to let that sit a while, make sure we don't end up with a puddle of fuel, and then I'll put these back on the bike. I've had this hooked up to this bottle full of fuel. I guess some of it's evaporated, but it's been hooked up here for probably 2 weeks at this point. Hasn't leaked anything, so we're going to go ahead and put these back on for the 15th time or whatever it is. It seems like every time I put these back on, it gets more and more difficult. One of you viewers suggested a ratchet strap, or said that was the way to do it. So I got the front boots down in and then pulled the rears down in with a ratchet strap and a block of wood. It's a little medieval, but it seemed to work. Also, the boots kind of rolled around, so I noticed that this morning and had to kind of undo it and get it back right. So I think that part's right. So next I'll put all this back together again. This is as far as I'm going to go back together for right now. I have everything hooked up. I did crank it to make sure the battery wasn't dead. Key on, choke. Let's see what happens. Now let's check for fuel pouring out. Bone dry. We call that a success. 3 so far. It's probably the most it's run in a couple years. So since I had the cooling system apart, etc., I'll let it warm up a little bit and fans come on, and then we'll go for a ride. So let's try out this helmet cam. I hope that riding footage wasn't too terrible. So I guess the key lesson learned from this project is to get the right O-rings to go between your carburetors, and don't try to cheat and get your own assortment, because they're probably not going to work. So these are some bizarre, weird sizes. But anyway, so far we're bone dry. Hope it will stay this way for the next 40 years. I have ridden this to work a few times. It's worked flawless. Kind of forgot how much fun this really was to ride and how easy. So anyway, stay tuned for more riveting content like this, and please reach down there and hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. See you next time.